I now give the floor to Ms. Idem Wosono.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Council, thank you for the opportunity to brief you on the humanitarian situation in South Sudan, a country which continues to face a severe humanitarian crisis driven by what SRSG Haysom has described as a perfect storm of stressors. South Sudan is indeed in the grips of a growing food insecurity crisis, as has just been referred to, a climate crisis, and an economic crisis, all while suffering the impact of the conflict in Sudan and dwindling financial support for the humanitarian response. Without immediate action, things will only get even worse in the weeks and months ahead. As we speak, more than 9 million people, or 76% of South Sudan's population, require humanitarian protection and assistance. Of them, 54% are children, 27% women. A total of 7.1 million people are acutely food insecure, an increase of around 1.5 million people since last year. Additionally, 2.5 million children and women are at risk of acute malnutrition, a number projected to reach 2.7 million by December due to the impact again of the crisis in neighboring Sudan. Mid-year projections by food security experts suggested that flooding combined with conflict could result in pockets of potential famine between June and January 2025. Worryingly, Mr. President, we are already seeing the impact of the flooding, again as referenced by SRSG Haysom. Heavy rain since May, as well as the calculated release of water from Lake Victoria, have led to increased Nile River levels, with floods so far impacting up to 300,000 people. At the peak of the flood season, anticipated between September and October, flooding could impact up to 3.3 million people. This includes communities yet to recover from the devastating floods which occurred between 2019 and 2022, and which displaced more than 1 million people each year. The Flood Response Preparedness and Response Plan for June to December 2024, developed by the government of South Sudan and humanitarian partners, seeks to assist 2.4 million people at an estimated cost of $264 million. I am pleased that the South Sudan government has already committed $76 million, 28% of the total amount required for immediate mitigation and preparedness actions. If the worst effects of the flooding are to be avoided and addressed urgently, support from donors will be critical. Mr. President, South Sudan's humanitarian plight is also being exacerbated by a deepening economic crisis. This has been largely triggered by the cessation since February 2024 of most oil exports through Sudan following the damage of the pipeline due to the conflict. Between January and July, the South Sudanese pound depreciated by more than 70%, drastically eroding the purchasing power of individuals and households and making basic commodities unaffordable for many. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, annual inflation reached 97% in June, with unbalanced rises in the cost of staple food items like sorghum and wheat flour. This has caused families to reduce the number of meals taken in a day, with, as is often the case, women and children bearing the brunt, as is often the case, eating least and eating last. Conditions are quite desperate, and some people are having to rely on wild vegetables and desert dates for sustenance. The economic crisis, compounded by new fuel taxes introduced in February, also severely hampered humanitarian operations in April and May before an exemption was granted. Mr. President, since I last briefed this Council on South Sudan in September 2023, the impact of the conflict in neighboring Sudan has continued to worsen. South Sudan is the country worst hit by the displacement crisis caused by the conflict next door after Chad. Almost 780,000 people have fled to South Sudan since the conflict began on 15 April 2023. More than 580,000 of this number are South Sudanese returnees. Many are arriving also in areas already deprioritized for assistance. They are often malnourished, in poor physical condition, and require life-saving assistance. The majority are women and children, many of whom require specialized support from the effects of trauma and gender-based violence. The intensifying conflict in Darfur and eastern Sudan threatens to exacerbate the situation. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, despite the challenges in South Sudan, I am pleased to note that the humanitarian community continues to deliver assistance. In the first half of this year, more than 2.6 million of the 6.6 million people targeted for humanitarian assistance in the Humanitarian Response Plan received some form of food, livelihoods, or cash assistance. More than 820,000 people were provided with healthcare services. More than 200,000 people received protection services, such as psychosocial counseling and access to safe spaces for women and children. And almost 600,000 people had access to safe water supplies. In addition, since mid-April last year, more than 210,000 returnees have received support to return to their homes or to relocate to other destinations of their choice. The already desperate situation is being further compounded, though, by humanitarian access constraints, most notably insecurity. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, as we prepare to mark World Humanitarian Day next week, it is worth reminding this Council that South Sudan, unfortunately, remains one of the most dangerous places for humanitarians to operate. Of the first half of 2024, 237 humanitarian access incidents were reported. Of these, 111 incidents, 46% of the total, involved violence against humanitarian personnel and humanitarian assets. 4 humanitarian aid workers have been killed in the line of duty since 2023. And convoys carrying life-saving supplies were subjected to illegal taxation and looting. This year, 30 incidents of looting at humanitarian facilities have been reported, a significant rise from a total of 32 incidents reported the whole of last year. Following the fuel crunch in April and May, critical food drops in the World Food Programme were halted, affecting 144,000 people. The United Nations Humanitarian Air Services flights frequency was also halved during this period, hindering critical missions by humanitarian actors to some of the most hard-to-reach field locations. Mr. President, despite all of this, humanitarian actors have been able to deliver assistance, as I said, due to the generous support of our donors. However, underfunding continues to hamper an adequate and timely humanitarian response. In 2024, only $561 million, representing 31% of the $1.8 billion needed under the Humanitarian Response Plan, has been received. We are grateful, but we need more. Some services are also on the verge of failure. The water, sanitation, and hygiene and the shelter non-food item pipelines are projected to collapse this month. The failure of a safe water treatment stockpile will leave 1.2 million people without essential water, sanitation, and hygiene services ahead of the severe flooding that is predicted. Allocations from the OCHA-managed pool funds have kept some essential frontline services afloat. $10 million has been released from the Central Emergency Response Fund and $26 million from the South Sudan Humanitarian Fund. However, more donor support for the humanitarian response is desperately needed. Mr. President, despite the bleak outlook in South Sudan, there is still a window of opportunity to act. Addressing the humanitarian situation in the country demands immediate, concerted, and decisive action on multiple fronts. 1, helping South Sudan to achieve political and economic stability. 2, addressing and mitigating the impact of the war in Sudan. 3, taking advantage of know-how and strong in-country humanitarian capacity to tackle food insecurity, help South Sudan prepare for severe flooding in support of government efforts, and support a humanitarian response commensurate with the huge levels of need. Every delay does cost lives. The humanitarian shortfalls are not just numbers. They translate into supply lines empty of food, untreated malnutrition, and unmet needs for basic shelter and sanitation. Finally, Mr. President, I urge all member states to reinforce their commitment to peace and stability in South Sudan. The pathway to recovery is through sustained investment in resilience and indeed development. The time to act is now. I thank you.